In terms of soldiers, sailors or airmen who sign a contract when they join the forces and then decide that they no longer wish to obey their instructions, there are various things they can do. They can have premature voluntary release, which means they can leave early if they object to the way things are happening. But if they decide to, in uniform, do things that are against the instructions of the government, then
simply lies. They cannot leave. Excuse me.
Once somebody has actually stood up in uniform and has started being a conscientious objector, there are certain things that fall into place. Before they stand up in uniform, they can prematurely, voluntarily leave the service. He elected to do it, I believe, the other way around. I don't know the full details, but that is probably sub judice, and we'll leave that aside. But there are means. I mean, clearly, you don't want in your military forces people who are not going to obey the will of the government. That is what we're there to do.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Peter.
Excuse me. I asked if he's right. Did he get enemies?
I have no idea what he'll get. The answer, there's a difference between the question of the Soviets' invitation into Afghanistan and the transitional government of Afghanistan, and then followed by the elected government of Afghanistan inviting in International Security Assistance Force. It is quite different. There are 43 nations in this invitation. NATO only took command of the total mission in 2005, 2006. The Soviet Union was an army of occupation, whereas all of the intention of the military forces that are in Afghanistan at the moment is to train the Afghans to take over from them so that they can leave. We have no desire to be in Afghanistan forever. The whole intent of the international mission, and it is an international mission, is to train the Afghan security forces to get the figures of government and the rule of law in place, reconstruct the country so that it can stand on its own feet, and then we'll be delighted to leave the Afghans at that point.
Thanks, Peter. No. Anybody else on the panel? Yes, Bruce.
Well, first of all, I recommend people to read up about William Douglas Hume, if they don't know about him, a British major who spent a year in prison at the end of the Second World War because, not a pacifist, he refused to open fire on civilians in the Havre, and he said he would not obey. And I think military who decide in their conscience and according to law that there are orders they can't accept are people who are heroes of our civilization.
Right.
I'm still waiting for someone to explain to me why we're there. Yes. Apart from insurgency, what has it got to do with what Gordon Brown says all the time, is securing our streets? Where is the link between terrorism and what's going on now in Afghanistan? Please, can I have that from somebody?
Thanks, Bruce. I'm going to get another set of questions.
Can I make a comment? This gentleman with the beard from Afghanistan, he was mentioning 3 specific milestones he felt kind of went unaddressed, particularly, which lie at the root of the Afghan conflict. But I think there's a 4th one, and I think that one could have pertained sometime after 2001, maybe 2002 in the Bonn Accord. And this was specifically something along the lines of the Committee of Transparency and Reconciliation, in which people who are currently standing for office for Parliament, people who are currently occupying positions as vice presidents or as provincial governors, with blood on their hands and human rights abuses to their name, if those things had been corrected and addressed, whether they were addressed with punishments or exile or whatever, if that had been achieved very, very early on, I think there would have been a much more solid platform put underneath Afghanistan's movement toward democracy, a clean democracy. It was not to do that job because the Americans could not do it, because Karzai was bringing all these guys into the cabinet and America was paying.
I've gone too far now.
No more. The lady over there, Frank Jackson, and gentleman here, and lady over there. Who are able to take Yeah, no, listen, we have got this. I don't know about how speakers are fixed, because I've got the hall till 9 o'clock.
Still half an hour.
Another half an hour. Are you okay, all the speakers? Okay, the only Michael has to go, but we can carry on. if you like, because I can see there is so much vibrancy in the room. The lady there,
Yes.
Frank, and the lady. Okay.
Okay, I'm Anne Kobayashi from Trident Ploughshares and CND and other things. And I just wanted to ask that given the difficulty of convincing people of your wish for their well-being, etc., at the same time as knowing that perhaps your relations, your families, have suffered at the hands of people in the same uniform, whatever the intentions of reconstruction troops, etc., it's very difficult to convince people of your integrity and your humanity when people in from the same group are bombing you. And that's a huge mixed message to send. So in the light of that, I just wondered, it's a question for the media person really, about to what extent does the Taliban, radio controlled, media controlled, can extend a sort of picture of the Western view of what's happening in Afghanistan? And to what extent is it purely they're bombing us, they're killing us, they're hurting our women and children? This is completely negative. Or is there some coverage of the anti-war lobby? And how do they spin that?
Okay, thanks very much for the question. Frank, the gentleman here, and the lady. But please be specific and not more than 30 seconds now. That's going to be the rule.
No, VJ, as gentlemen here said, we're having a debate, and there's a lot of points to it. Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. Now there's been a lot of emotion here, and quite rightly so, because it's a very emotional issue, but I want to be more analytical. Let's go back to 9/11. The attack on the World Trade Center was a crime, a heinous crime, but it was not an act of war. But the United States response to that was to take it as an act of war and attack a very poor country in Afghanistan. Now, as editor of the journal, of WDC's journal, I've published a number of things at that, in response to that, including, there's talk about negotiations with the Taliban. There was ample opportunity for negotiation with the Taliban at that time. There were whole loads of aspects of international law that could have been brought in, but in particular, one American international lawyer that I published at that time drew attention to something that very, very few people here will ever have heard of: the Montreal Convention on Sabotage, which was an agreement to which both the United States and Afghanistan were parties, and that could have been invoked as a means of getting at the people who were behind the 9/11. There's many other aspects that are worth mentioning, but obviously our chair is being very strict here. But
irresponsible, not strict.
And the final point, I'm sorry, I'm making a comment, VJ, which I think is a valuable one. I've been involved in this a long time. So it's not only questions. The panel are not the fountains of all wisdom. Yes. If I wasn't interrupted, I would do. Sorry. Now, if there had not been all the destruction, there would not be so much necessity for reconstruction. So if we go back to the beginning and accept, if you're going to negotiate, the first thing you need to recognise is that the initial attack was wrong, illegal and wrong morally as well, and then you can start negotiation on a sensible basis and stop the bombing in particular, which is indiscriminate.
Thank you. Thanks.